Three teenagers were playing by a pond when suddenly a dark shadow floated up from the bottom of the water. When they looked closer, they realized it was a diver, but something seemed off about him. He was lying motionless in the water and there were no bubbles coming up around him. The three of them sensed something was wrong, so they jumped into the water to check, only to find that the person was no longer breathing. The Buford diving incident. In the Chassahowitzka Wildlife Management Area in Florida, USA, there's a freshwater spring called Buford Spring. Buford Spring is only about 9 kilometers away from Eagle's Nest Sinkhole. Buford Spring is known as one of the most beautiful underwater caves in Florida. The water inside is crystal clear with excellent visibility, and when sunlight streams through the surface, it looks absolutely stunning. The water temperature stays around 21 degrees Celsius year-round, so ever since the cave was discovered, it's attracted more and more diving enthusiasts. It's said that some people have spotted alligators and water moccasins inside, so if you're snorkeling, you should definitely be careful. This is the cave map of Buford Sink. Looks pretty simple. The entrance to the cave is at the bottom of the pond. Once you go down, there's a huge underwater chamber, also called the hall. At the bottom, there's a slope that tilts downward at a 45-degree angle, covered with massive rocks, which probably fell off over the years as the hall was eroded by water. At a depth of 51 meters underwater, the slope levels out and becomes horizontal again. 51 meters is also the deepest point of this cave. There's a concrete statue here that divers call Kurt's Chicken Rock, which was erected in memory of underwater photographer Kurt Owen. Continuing to the right, the passage gradually narrows, and unlike the hall, the bottom in this area is all silt with no natural light at all. At the far right is the end of the cave, where there's a siphon about 13 centimeters high. The water from Buford Spring flows in from here. Although this cave doesn't look particularly complex, you still need a cave diving certification to dive here, and the narrow passage area is recommended only for CCR technical divers. But since this place really isn't as complex as the nearby Eagle's Nest sinkhole, a lot of people tend to ignore this rule, which has gradually led to accidents happening. On the morning of June 22, 2022, 52-year-old Todd and 63-year-old Stephen drove to Buford Spring. Both of them were diving enthusiasts and neighbors, but neither had a full cave diving certification. When they arrived at Buford Springs, they found 3 teenagers swimming there. As the two of them put on their gear, they chatted with the teens. About 10 minutes later, the 3 teenagers came ashore to rest while Todd and Stephen jumped into the water. They only brought 1 air tank, and it was filled with regular compressed air. Once everything was ready, the two of them entered the cave chamber from the bottom of the pond. They were immediately captivated by the stunning scenery inside. Sunlight streamed through the cave entrance all the way to the bottom, casting ripples of light across the rocks. It was absolutely beautiful. As they swam around the chamber, it felt like they were in a sci-fi movie. It was completely surreal. After about half an hour, the two of them resurfaced, and the 3 teenagers were still resting on the shore. After greeting each other, the teens just sat there listening to Todd and Stephen chat. Still not satisfied, Todd and Stephen didn't come ashore either. Since the dive had gone so smoothly and wasn't really challenging, the two of them started discussing whether they should go even deeper to take a look. During their conversation, Todd mentioned that his tank seemed to be leaking a little, but after a while they still decided to go for another dive. 20 minutes later, the teens on shore noticed a dark figure suddenly floating up from the bottom of the water. It looked a lot like one of the divers who had gone down earlier. The person was face down in the water, and the 3 thought he was just looking down at his dive buddy, so they didn't pay much attention. But after 2 minutes, the person still hadn't moved at all, and there were no bubbles coming up around him. The 3 teens felt something was wrong, so they jumped into the water to check and discovered that it was Todd, but he didn't seem to be breathing anymore. They tried to pull him to shore, but Todd was just too heavy, so they couldn't manage it. With no other choice, they had to call the police. It was around 12:20 p.m. at the time. Police and rescue personnel arrived at the scene 2 hours later. They first carried Todd up onto the shore, but found that he had already been dead for quite some time. Next, 2 rescue divers entered the water to search for Stephen. After about 10 minutes, they found him on a gentle slope 42 meters underwater, but Stephen had also drowned. After that, his body was recovered. After a preliminary inspection, police found that both men's air tanks were completely empty. Just as the 3 teenagers had heard, there was indeed a minor leak at the connection between Todd's regulator and the tank valve, but it wasn't serious. Later, the coroner performed autopsies and ruled out the possibility of disease or other injuries. They concluded that the cause of death for both men was fairly straightforward. They drowned after running out of air. Based on the dive computer data from both men, experts were able to roughly reconstruct the entire sequence of events. After their first dive, Todd and Stephen mistakenly took the reading on the pressure gauge as the remaining air volume and thought they had enough air for another dive. They had only dived in the main chamber, there wouldn't have been any problem. But after going down, they headed straight for the deeper parts of the cave. A few minutes later, they reached the statue and then continued to the right. At this this point, all natural light had disappeared and the silt in the water increased significantly. They kept swimming further in, and as they stirred up more and more mud, the visibility in the water began to drop sharply. It was only then that they started to get scared, and their breathing became rapid. After that, they decided to turn back, but when they got back to a depth of 42 meters underwater, something unexpected happened. It seemed like Steven's regulator had malfunctioned. He couldn't get any air at all. Actually, his breathing regulator wasn't broken. It was just that the pressure in his tank was too low, so the regulator automatically stopped supplying air. In other words, he was out of air. Panicked, Steven didn't even have time to inflate his vest before he stopped struggling. So why didn't Todd share his air with him? Experts believe that by that time, Todd's air supply was probably almost gone as well. Maybe he had tried to share his air with Steven, but in the end he had to give up because otherwise he wouldn't have been able to make it back to the surface himself, let alone decompress. In those final moments, Todd held his breath while inflating his vest and quickly ascended toward the surface. With the last bit of consciousness he had left, he struggled to crawl out of the cave entrance. But unfortunately, he was still a dozen or so seconds too late. Todd started drowning before he reached the surface, and in the end, it was the buoyancy of his vest that brought him up to the surface. When the three teenagers saw him, if Todd had been pulled to shore and given first aid immediately, there might still have been a chance. But you can't expect three kids who are only about 15 or 16 to know what to do. Honestly, even most of you watching this probably don't know how to perform CPR. So from the moment the two of them decided to go down, their fate was already sealed. Since neither of them brought any recording equipment, what happened above is just the experts' speculation. We may never know exactly what they encountered down there, but the causes of this accident are pretty obvious. First, they didn't have full cave diving certification, which meant they overlooked many of the dangers involved in cave diving. Second, they used tanks that weren't suitable for long cave dives and didn't have a backup plan. At the very least, they should have brought double tanks. Third, they still went into the water even though they knew there might be a leak in the tank. If Todd's tank hadn't been leaking, he might have survived. After all, he was only a breath or two away from making it. Fourth, they clearly violated the rule of thirds in diving, which is extremely dangerous in cave diving. Fifth, there was a lack of safety protocols, such as not arranging for support divers to monitor them or failing to make a dive plan in advance. In short, this was a classic example of a preventable diving accident. It serves as another warning to diving enthusiasts that cave diving is not a recreational activity. Before every dive, you should always follow strict certification, planning, redundancy, and team rules. After all, it's not someone else facing the risks, it's the diver themselves. Alright, that's the end of this video. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.